Hello, brothers and sisters. I hope you're well. What is going on between the United States and China? Or let's say between the United States and the rest of the world. As you know, many Chinese companies, they've gone online on many different platforms explaining how the supply chain pretty much works. Are we talking about luxury brands? Okay, we're talking about fashion and many other things. This wasn't something that known. Okay, like if you know about this, you knew about it. That China does manufacture the goods, and then they send them to the USA and other countries, France, for example, and they just put the label on it. Okay, this was something known. It's something known as well that the Chinese have really good quality when it comes to manufacturing, like bags and many other things. You can find bad quality goods in China, and you can find good quality goods in China. I remember when I was a child where things were used to be made in America. It was exactly the same thing. You could find good quality products from America and really bad quality products from America. Then the Americans shifted the production to China because the bosses of these big companies, they're looking for cheaper places to manufacture their goods, and China was there. So now what we have is a trade war. I still remember in 2017, um, let's say to now 2025, 2017, yeah, we have let's summarize what happened in this period. The US right now, they have engaged in a prolonged and deeply impactful trade conflict, the US and China. And the US has started all this basically. So this is kind of reshaping the global market, is reshaping the supply chains and also the political alliances. So this multi-phase economic standoff between Donald Trump and the Chinese government, okay, which all began under Donald Trump administration, and then it intensified now into 2025. This has had significant consequences for both the American and the Chinese economies, as well as collateral implications for Europe and other broader international systems. Okay, so let's make it clear this is not something new. This has happened before, okay, not only with Trump, with other presidents as well, okay. But Trump, he is a patriot. Yeah, he's an individual that wants America to be great again. All right, he wants to bring the factories back into America and then take them away from China, which is something pretty much impossible at this stage. China is the strongest country in the world economically. China has the supply chains. China has the deal with different countries, and the US, they might want to kick a lot right now, but they will understand that there's not much that they can do against China at this point. And as I said before, this was started by Donald Trump, not by China. And now you have many Americans online praising Donald Trump, saying how good he's doing with these tariffs, which is increasing the price of every product they consume in the USA. And at the same time, although it's devaluating the Chinese yuan, this is somehow helping the Chinese because for them, having a weaker currency means that they become more competitive in the international market because the goods are worth less. Okay, so remember, let's do between phase one and phase two. Phase one was 2017 to 2021, okay, which was the initiation and adaptation. So you have US measures imposed. In 2018, the Donald Trump administration, they launched the first salvo of what will become a trade war. Um, and what they did invoke a section from the 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. There you go. And they were citing unfair Chinese trade practices. And they were also saying that the Chinese were forcing American companies to transfer technologies. And also, they were accusing China of intellectual property theft. So, because of this, the US imposed tariffs on pretty much 50 billion worth of Chinese goods. Now, when they say when they talk about these unfair practices like forced technology transfers, you need to understand that in order for the Chinese to become what they are today, okay, to become the factory of the whole world, they signed very smart contracts with these European and Western companies, where you get into an agreement with a Chinese company. Okay, it's not like you can come here and start doing your own thing. You need a passport, some kind of passport with what's a Chinese company. And that Chinese company will learn from you, Western company, on how you manufacture things. So the Chinese people could also benefit from this. Okay. So due to this, these Chinese companies learn from the Western companies. And this wasn't something forced. The Western companies agreed to this. This was part of the agreement. This was part of the contract. And they were happy with it because salaries were low and China was a market where there were people that they knew pretty much how to do everything. Okay. So by the end of 2019, the total tariff Chinese imports have really escalated to over 300 billion. So the average of these tariffs were between 10% to 25%, hitting many products. Okay. For example, the main ones that were hit were electronics, machinery, steel, solar panels, and also automotive parts or vehicle parts. Okay. Then the American sanctions also targeted specific Chinese companies. Between them is an infamous one in America, which is Huawei. If you live in America, most probably you won't be able to use the phones. You might not be able to use the 5G technology. Okay. But if you live in other countries, you'll be benefiting from all this. Okay. And because the Americans don't have this technology, they pretty much stop Huawei from expanding the 4G and 5G technology. They also uh, instructed Canada pretty much to in, take into prison, okay, the daughter of the CEO of that company. Okay, so then you have another companies like what was the name? I think it was ZTE, who they also face similar restrictions as Huawei. Okay, as you can see here, this is the US basically saying, okay, because we don't have this technology, we're not going to allow the Chinese to come into our country to provide this technology. We'd rather wait for an American company to develop this technology, and then we'll be providing it to the American people, which it hasn't happened at all. Okay. Then the Trump administration's goal was merely punitive. So it sought to force a structural reforms within China and rebalance the trade deficit. But the result was widespread economic disruption. So the Chinese also responded to these sanctions. Okay, in response, China retaliated with tariffs on over 110 billion US goods, particularly focusing on agricultural products such as soybean, pork, corn, and wheat. These measure, these measures from the Chinese, if I remember well, they have a devastated effect on American farmers whose exports to China did completely plummet. Okay, soybeans alone, which the Chinese consume a lot, they dropped from 12.2 billion in 2017 to 3.1 billion in 2018. So the US federal government responded with over 28 billion in subsidies to the agricultural sector. That means that the US have to take money out of the US taxpayers and use that to subsidize the agricultural sector. And US always complain about Chinese practices and how unfair they are. But subsidizing these agricultural sectors is not something that the US has done only in response to China. They have also done it to support the agricultural products in other countries, to flood other countries with cheap agricultural products, like in Africa, in Latin America as well. They've done this many times. They give money to the farmers so they don't lose too much when they sell the goods for cheap in other countries. So, beyond these tit-for tariffs, China also began to implement a strategic response across multiple fronts. One was the diversification of trade partners. So China depended, um, it depended too much in the US, but they deepened their economic partnerships across Asia, Europe, and Africa. They signed new trade agreements and they did lower the import tariffs on goods from countries within the Asian, as well as with South Korea, Brazil, and obviously Russia. They also increased their engagement with the European Union through investment pacts and closer economic dialogues. So this trade, this trade pivot helped reduce reliance on the US market, and it did shield the Chinese economy from a deeper shock. Number two, they did have a promotion. They did promote. If I remember, they have this program of promoting domestic consumption. So China, they did launch initiative to kind of stimulate the internal demand within the country and reducing its dependence on exports or imports from other countries. So these government-led stimulus and social policies, they did raise these possible incomes and provided incentives for consumption in rural and urban areas. So between 2018 and 2020, retail sales growth, they did grow consistently and they outpaced industrial production, which was a sign to show that there was a shift in the economic structure. So now the Chinese, they have the knowledge to produce all these goods that Western companies used to produce. And what they've done now, they're encouraging Chinese companies to create these goods, to sell them internally in the country, and they're also encouraging their own people to consume these goods from Chinese companies. Then they have a technological self-reliance, okay? So China did accelerate its Made in China 2025 initiative, and they did focus a lot on core industries. This was the semiconductors industry, which is, there is another trade war on this because Taiwan, which is some kind of rebel territory in China that the US support and they want to recognize as independent, they're the ones producing this type of semiconductors, okay? And the US pretty much invested a lot in it. But then China, mainland China, they also did the same thing. They invested in semiconductors. They invested in robotics. They invested in AI, in aerospace, and also a lot in green energy, EV cars. Okay. Then they did a heavy investment in domestic R&D and support for firms like SMIC, which is the China's largest chip maker, and the aim was to counteract the Western technological denial. So between 2017 and 2021, China doubled its semiconductor design capacity and increased a state-led VC investment by over 200%. Then they also have a change when it comes to currency and financial measures. So the People's Bank of China allowed the yuan to gradually depreciate. I know it sounds crazy, but they allowed it to lose value, falling from 6.7 to over 7.15 per USD to buffer the impact of tariffs and support exporters. At the same time, China maintained foreign reserves around 3 trillion to stabilize capital markets. Then there was also a legal and regulatory adjustment, and this was in response to global criticism, including from the USA, from the European Union, and from the World Trade Organization. China introduced new laws on foreign investment and intellectual property. It created a specialized IP court and offered market access liberalization in sectors like finance and automotive. These actions help attract European and Asian investors even between these US tensions. So the biggest banks in the world at this moment, they are Chinese banks. Okay. Many of them are state-owned Chinese banks because they invest massively in many countries. Okay. Although they have many reserves of US dollars, they have reserve of other currencies as well. Then you have the Chinese government that have their own trillions of debt of the US. So if the Chinese actually want to destroy the US, they'll be able to do it. Okay. Then what happened in the US during this period? And we still in phase one. So the US economy, they at the beginning, I remember they continue to grow, okay, but there were quite a lot of frictions. So by 2020, the GDP growth rate is low by 2.2%, with some economists attributing 0.3% to 0.6% of the slowdown to trade tensions. So prices rose for imported consumer goods, and there were some estimates that suggested that tariffs raised annual consumer costs by $800 per household. Okay, and approximately 245,000 jobs were lost due to disrupted supply chain and reduced exports. So don't think that Americans won't be affected because of the tariffs, because many jobs and many businesses will close if the Chinese goods are not shipped to America. There are many American people saying, ah ha ha, all these Chinese containers that they were heading towards the USA have to turn back to China because of the tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. Amazon did stop many shipments to the USA from China because of the tariffs. But let me tell you something. If Amazon has stopped this, it's not because they agree with Trump and his policies and the tariffs he imposed in China. They stopped this because now the cost of the product plus the tariffs is too much. Therefore, it's going to have an effect on the price of every single product that they market in the website. Okay. Therefore, they're going to have to stop all these shipments to the USA and then recalculate the prices of the products if possible. But as you can see, many millionaires, billionaires, they put pressure on Donald Trump in order to at least stop these tariffs temporarily until they find a solution, okay, to what he's planning to do. Then, what happened in China during this period? So, the growth of China, the economic growth, it did decelerate, okay, from 6.8% in 2017 to 6.1% in 2019, the lowest in nearly 3 decades. So, export volumes to the US declined, but total exports only fell modestly due to trade redirections. So China experienced industrial upgrading and improved technological capabilities as an indirect benefit of these sanctions. So you can see the sanctions in Russia after the war in Ukraine, they also forced Russia to invest in their own industries, mainly in the military industry, and to seek for different trade partners, which were not the US and which was not the European countries. And the price of oil, the price of gas increased so much that the sanctions did not have an effect because the Russians continue selling this gas and this oil to other countries at the market price. Some of it at a reduced price. And then these other countries like India, they'll pretty much sell the Russian gas at a higher price to the Europeans, which is dumb. But anyways, let's get back into the trade war. Now we're going to phase two, which is the more contemporary um, event that took place recently in 2025. So now we have a full escalation and global, how they sell it, reverberations. Okay, so there was another confrontation now. The US, Trump was voted as the president of the US, and he's been saying that for many years. You know, I'm going to impose tariffs on Chinese steel. I'm going to impose tariffs on Chinese goods. And look, he did it. He did it at a time where he wasn't ready to do it, to be honest with you. Okay. So, under this renewed pressure from Congress and geopolitical disputes, including in the South China Sea and Taiwan Straits, Donald Trump has decided to impose these tariffs. Now we need to think if these tariffs are related to the geopolitical pressures that they're also imposing in the South China Sea. Because the idea is to weaken China economically, so China won't be able to confront the USA somehow in their own territory. Okay, but as I said before, China has the technology to destroy any um, American uh, boat, any American gunship that appears in the South China Sea. So they're really easy targets. Okay, so now we have these renewed US sanctions. So in January 2025, the US government, citing persistent trade imbalances, intellectual property violation, and national security threats, they raised the tariffs to a blanket 125% on most Chinese goods. Pretty much the same thing they did in 2018. So this move was tantamount to an embargo on many product categories, especially electronic, pharmaceuticals, and rare earth based components. And listen to the last one, rare earth based components, which the America need a lot from China, from the for the military technological advancements. Okay, so it's really strange what happened. But listen, there was an additional 10% universal import duty, which was introduced on all imported goods, regardless of the origin. Okay, from all the countries, and this was aimed at boosting domestic industry in the U.S. So the US also launched a Rare Earth Independence Act, funding domestic extraction and refining projects to reduce dependency on Chinese sources. Now you have the US saying we're gonna do our own thing, we're gonna strengthen our economy, but first of all, they don't have the people to do it. The people in the US, they pretty much work for the military industry. And all the industries around, they benefit from the military industry, from the financial industry. So many of the companies that are in the US, I'm not saying that all of them, but many rely on the industry. Engineering companies, um, even service companies, companies that provide services, okay, they rely on the military industry. So how are you going to stop the imports of rare earth um, minerals if you need that for that industry, for that specific industry, right? And then in the US, if you see at what people normally study in the US, there's not enough people to lift the market again, okay? To how to say, to revive the market, to take over these jobs that the Chinese are doing back home. There's many American people that don't have the knowledge on how to do this. And if you look at American workforce, many of them they didn't study about these industries. So how are you gonna revive an economy if you don't have the necessary means to do it? And the main thing is having people with the knowledge to do it. Okay. So now after imposing these crazy sanctions of 125%, China also responded to this. So China retaliated with an equal 125% tariff on all US goods, effectively halting bilateral trade. And as I told you before, in 2018, when China responded to the US, this had a huge effect in the farmers. Okay, farming in America is big. So if the Chinese decide to stop buying soybeans from the USA and they go to another market to buy it, this is going to have a huge effect in the American farmers. Okay, so China they also cut these rare earth exports, including neodymium, dysprosium, and yttrium, which has an impact on U.S. defense and tech sectors, as I told you before. The Chinese they increased, or let's say they boosted the trade with Latin America, African countries, and Southeast Asia, with a 40% increase in exports to the Asian and 25% increase to BRICS partners by mid 2025. This is the aim. So as you can see here, they're just following the same protocol they followed in 2018. The Chinese they also roll out domestic subsidies for industries impacted by US tariffs, totaling over 150 billion. So remember how the US they supported the agricultural industries by pretty much subsidizing them. Now, the Chinese have done the same for the industries that have been affected by these US tariffs. China also doubled down on its Belt and Road Initiative, offering debt relief and infrastructure packages to friendly states, enhancing soft power amid this rift. Then, what are the 2025 economic impacts in both countries? So, in the United States, the GDP growth did slow to a projected 1.5% in 2025. Manufacturing indices show contraction for 3 consecutive quarters. Then you have consumer inflation, which it did a spike in electronics, clothing, and automobile parts. We saw prices increase of 5 to 12%. So, like in the past, same thing is happening again. But this time, this is affecting the electronic goods because you have Intel, which is, I think, is a US computer company, which pretty much exports the computer into the US. Now, US consumers, they won't be able to buy these computers at a cheap price. Okay. Same thing goes for iPhones, for every electronic good you can think about. they all manufacture in China, but then US hold the intellectual right over these products and they sell them as US products, but they manufacture in China. So if you put tariffs on products imported from China, this is going to have a huge effect on the price of these products. Now, the foreign direct investment into the US declined by nearly 8% in quarter one of 2025 as firms reevaluated the risk exposure. So, what happened in China? So, in China, the export revenue from the US market previously was 440 billion annually. It dropped by 75%. This is huge. Okay. The employment in export heavy provinces like Guangdong and Jiangsu, it did shrink by 2.1 million jobs. So, despite this short term pain, internal demand and Asian trade lifted GDP growth to a modest 4.5%, narrowly missing the 5.0% target China had for that first quarter. So, although this has a huge effect in China, many people lost their jobs. Some companies also closed. Well, remember, the Chinese government was subsidizing these companies. And two, because they shifted trade towards these Asian, South American, and African countries, they managed to almost hit the target when it comes to GDP growth. Now, there's another actor into this, which is Europe. So Europe also reacted to this because many European countries they were also affected by these trade wars, by these tariffs imposed by Donald Trump. As I told you, there was a universal tariff of 10% of all the imports into the US. Now, they you know, like the USA is kind of shifting from Ukraine. They want to kind of stop this war, okay? And the Europeans don't want that because you have Ursula von der Leyen in power right now, who is 100% responsible for what happened in Ukraine. And now she's not going to align with Donald Trump, okay? So they're seeing this as a way to seek more autonomy and independence from the USA. So Europe was caught in the crossfire. So initially, they were benefiting from this diverted trade, okay? You have German auto parts replacing US goods in China. The EU later faced a flood of low-priced Chinese products redirected from the US, okay? So in early 2025, the European Commission launched a Readiness 2030. This was a program, right? It was 800 billion initiative for industrial resilience, rare earth processing, and digital infrastructure. So the EU leaders also pursue neutrality, encouraging de-escalation via diplomatic efforts. However, individual countries diverge. So individual countries like France and Germany, they emphasize in a strategic autonomy and defense investments because this is a huge opportunity for these two countries, which are economic powerhouses in the EU, okay, to start selling their own goods to China. So the Eastern European Union states, they did increase trade with China and Russia, complicating Brussels' unified stance. So by mid 2025, the EU, well, will face internal debates, and they were talking about embracing the transatlantic alignment or seek balanced engagement with China to avoid an economic fallout. Okay, so what is the conclusion of all this? So the US-China trade war from 2017 to 2025 was more than a tariff argument. Okay, it was a systemic economic clash that forced a realignment in global trade, strategy, and finance. Both countries did suffer setbacks, rising costs, lower growth, and frayed supply chains, also many job losses. Yet, both also adapted, with China emerging as a more self-reliant than the US, okay, and reinforcing its domestic industrial base, which helped to create the China we know today. Europe was caught between these two giants, and they invested in autonomy while juggling competing interests. So the future remains uncertain, with economic blocs more fragmented and international trade facing increasing uh, politicization. However, the crisis also ignited innovation, resilience, and the rethinking of the globalization itself. Okay. Now, something important to know: how does how did Africa help into all this? Let's just start with the word tariff. Okay, where does it come from? If you've been in Spain, in southern Spain, there is a city called Tarifa. Okay, who is right in the Mediterranean Sea. Okay, and back in the times when you have the Northern African um, Arabs and also sub-Saharan Africans, because the Moors were black and Arab people together, right? They're pretty much Muslims. They invaded the peninsula for 800 years. Okay, so they gave many names, and many remain to date in the southern part of Spain. So this little enclave called Tariff, okay, that was a point where all the ships that were going through the Mediterranean, moving into the Atlantic, they have to pass through. So they have to pay money, they have to pay tax to the authorities in order to pass through there. And it was a really important trade route. And as I told you, it was called tariff. And this is the reason why today we have the word tariff. Okay, it comes from there. So there you go, an historical class today. Anyways, I hope you like this analysis. Yeah, please, if you like it, share it, like it, share it with your friends, and as always, I'll continue informing you.